Hello and welcome. I'm Karen Grunberg. I'm the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the Associate Director for Israel Studies here at the University of Texas. Today's event is part of our regular lecture series, Israel in Context, housed in the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank the Schusterman Center, as well as our co-sponsors for this event, for their support, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Department of English, the Program in Comparative Literature, the Humanities Institute. So thank you to all of these units for their support. And now Dr. Yael Segalovitz. Dr. Yael Segalovitz, a scholar and translator specializing in global modernisms, is an assistant professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and is currently spending the year as a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Her recently published book, How Close Reading Made Us, which was published earlier this year by SUNY, and is available, and we have a discount code if anybody is interested. I can set you up with that afterwards. The book follows the 20th century global circulation of close reading as a technique of the self from the US to Brazil and Israel. Her work has appeared in Modern Fiction Studies, Arizona Quarterly, Textual Practice, and Simploque. I've only ever seen it written, so among other venues. She hosts the podcast Psychoanalyterature, which follows key figures in literary studies and in psychoanalysis, including Judith Butler, Maggie Nelson, and Jane Gallup. Her talk today will take a closer look at one comparison that she undertakes in this recent book. The talk is titled To Read or Not to Be, Faulkner, A.B. Yehoshua, and the Transnational Circulation of Close Reading. Please welcome Dr. Yael Segalovitz.
Thank you. Do I need a microphone or can you hear me, guys? Yeah, I think that's yeah? Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I would like to start by thanking Karen Grunberg and the Schusterman Center for this generous invitation, and to Michal Kalo, the one and only, whom I had a pleasure of teaching years ago in Israel, for making these connections possible. Indeed, it is precisely these intellectual affinities, what we sometimes dismiss as the mere social fabric of academia, these connections between scholars across borders and languages, that stand at the center of my thinking about the global circulation of close reading, which I'll be discussing with you today. As many of you know, close reading has been at the center of a heated debate in the humanities, and particularly in literary studies, since the turn of the century. These debates, which have come to be known as the method wars, constitute a crucial conversation among literary scholars about how text should be read and what political, ethical, and identitarian implications our methods of reading carry. As you can see in the quotes that I've chosen here, when Franco Moretti proposes his alternative of distant reading, or when Stephen Bast and Sharon Marcus advance their surface reading, they position themselves against and in relation to close reading, the foundational method of 20th century literary analysis. For example, close reading for Moretti is a theological practice that he's pushing against, and Bast and Marcus prize close reading's proximity to the text, which they want to emulate. But these details are not the gist of what I want to tell you today. What I want to highlight is that for these critics, as for many others, close reading functions still today as the compass point of literary studies, the reference point against which other methods or other ways of engaging literature position themselves. It's not surprising then that recently scholars have turned back to close reading and to its roots in the School of New Criticism, the school that developed this practice in the US in mid-20th century. This re-examination of New Criticism history and pedagogy has produced important works by, among others, as you can see, Joseph North, Rachel Sagner-Burna, and Laura Heffernan, and Andy Hines. As their scholarship has reminded us, while New Criticism developed first, or has its roots in 1920 England, its most distinctive and institutionalized development occurred in the United States, Close reading emerged at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where a group of scholars developed a reading practice, close reading, that demanded concentration and patience as an explicit reaction against what they perceived as the cultural destruction in the industrialized North. And you can see in the pictures here books that I'm sure many of you know, like The Well-Wrought Urn and The Verbal Icon. Close reading would later be canonized at Yale University and become the dominant, largely uncontested mode of interpretation in the US until approximately the 1970s. Another facet of new criticism that I want you to keep in mind as we talk is that the modernist writer William Faulkner, to whom I'll return later on, was among the writers most valued by the new critics. And you can see here Cleanth Brooks with his 2-volume important book on William Faulkner. Indeed, these scholars were largely responsible for the canonization and Faulkner's eventual Nobel Prize status. But what I find notably missing or absent from contemporary examinations of close reading is a transnational decentralizing perspective. That is, current scholarship generally assumes that new criticism and its method of close reading were strictly an Anglo-American phenomena. But while scholars ardently debate the relationship between British predecessors and the American new critics, they rarely considered what occurred beyond the anglophone orbit. The truth of the matter is that new criticism had a significant and rich transnational circulation. And this global reach has begun to be recognized in recent scholarship, notably by Peter Button and David Stewart and Paul Nadal, who write about new criticism in China, Taiwan, and the Philippines. But these investigations remain limited in scope. What I would like to talk to you today and what my work focuses on, as you can see in the book that Karen generously mentioned, is the crucial travels of new criticism from the US to Brazil and Israel. And Brazil and Israel are no random choice. In those two locations, the arrival of new criticism brings about nothing less than an intellectual and literary revolution. This importation of new criticism occurs through the border crossing of two central intellectuals and their dialogue with American scholars and with each other. You can see here the Israeli Benjamin Harshav, who I'll return to him later on, and the Brazilian Afrânio Coutinho. Unfortunately, I'll have to relegate the discussion of his work to the Q&A if you guys would be interested. These journeys reveal how the so-called periphery of world literature actively and unexpectedly modified the never singular American source, adapting it to local languages, interpretative traditions, and socio-political realities. In addition, these travels demonstrate how close reading was conceived from its very inception as a tool for self-formation, a way to shape readers. Furthermore, these travels demonstrate how new criticism and the ideal of the close reader had a deep impact on modernist production. And you can see here Clarice Lispector from Brazil and Yehuda Amichai from Israel. Again, these are names that I won't be able to engage with, but are part of the project. So how did all of this happen? Let me begin by reading you how close reading is presented in a prominent Israeli undergraduate textbook. And I start with this quote because textbooks, I believe, represent the final and most crystallized stage in any cultural adaptation and understanding of theoretical and practical concepts. This textbook entry can provide us with a key into understanding how close reading was transformed as it entered the Hebrew-speaking cultural sphere, what processes of conceptual and linguistic translation it underwent, and to what ends. In this section, the literary critic Hannah Herzig introduces students to new criticism and to its characteristic practice of close reading. And she writes, "A central concept in the new criticism understanding of literature is the organic unity of the literary text. This conception draws an implicit comparison between the literary text as a living organism, a natural entity. A living organism, for example, the human body, is structured so that each of its parts necessarily serves a function in relation to the whole. Similarly, the text is understood as a totality that operates through the interrelations among its components, which necessarily form a unified whole. This new critical conception led to the adoption of a reading style called close reading. Meticulous attention to every detail in the text and the actualization of all potential connections between them under the assumption that each detail serves a function in the construction of meaning. Now, the first two lines of this passage echo, as I'm sure you know, the standard account of American New Criticism that would appear in any US textbook. The New Critic's conception of the literary text as a living organism, an autonomous and unified object. But from the third line onward, the Israeli textbook articulates a distinctive understanding of New Criticism, one barely present in American scholarship. The emphasis on the functionality of every textual detail and the centrality of the reader's mental effort in extracting maximum meanings and connections from the literary work's details. I'd like to propose today that close reading in its Hebrew incarnation was conceived as a practice whose primary aim was the integration of the literary text, and that this emphasis on formalist processes of integration emerged as a response to the acute sense of social disintegration that haunted Israeli society in the 1970s. While the critics who developed the Israeli version of New Criticism explicitly denied any political dimension to their reading method of close reading, the 1917 novels of celebrated Hebrew modernist Aleph Bet Yehoshua exposed the connections between Israeli close reading, American New Criticism, and contemporary Israeli political discourse with its anxiety about social dissolution. In this intellectual history, and this is the case with the Israeli, but also the Brazilian and American one, what comes to view is that close reading is not a historical and apolitical formalist practice as it is often claimed to be. In fact, it is a method deeply embedded in the socio-political pressures of its time and place. So why do I turn to the modernist Aleph Bet Yehoshua specifically? Yehoshua is one of Israel's most acclaimed novelist and public intellectual until his recent death in 2022. He has left behind a rich legacy of novels, short stories, plays, essays, and children's books, and he is world-renowned and widely translated. But I turn to Yehoshua not merely for his canonical status, but because he occupies a pivotal position in the intellectual network that I am mapping today. Yehoshua's work was profoundly shaped by William Faulkner, who we now recall also served as a literary model for the New Critics. In addition, Yehoshua collaborated closely with the Tel Aviv School, the influential group of scholars who were the first to import and locally adapt new critical thought into the Israeli sphere. Beyond these literary and academic connections, Yehoshua was also deeply invested in examining and confronting the social ruptures emerging in 1970s Israeli society. This unique position as a writer in dialogue with Faulkner, a collaborator with the local New Critics, and a writer deeply engaged with Israel's social transformations makes Yehoshua's novels, written at the height of the New Criticism Israeli reception, particularly revealing to the Israeli iteration of close reading. How then did New Criticism make its way to Israel? Here we go. The key intellectual mediator between the American theory and the Israeli version was Benjamin Arshav, who I mentioned before, formerly called Horoshovsky. In fact, Arshav is the one who defines the temporal borders of my argument. In 1967, he establishes the department that, as we will see, was central for the reception of New Criticism in Israel, and in 1984, he leaves Israel for the US. Arshav was first exposed to New Criticism during his undergraduate studies at the Hebrew University, where he studied under the then department chair Shimon Halkin, who himself spent most of his life in New York and was deeply familiar with new critical scholarship. He was also, as his students testify, an entirely faithful new critic in the classroom. And during Harshav's graduate studies in the 1950s, he continues to engage with the new critics, this time at Yale under René Wellick, who was one of the central figures of American new criticism and was himself deeply engaged in dialogue also with Czech structuralism, which will also inform Harshav's work in many ways. When Harshav returns to Israel in 1967, he opens the Department of General and Comparative Literature at Tel Aviv University. And at the heart of this department, he develops what will be called the Tel Aviv School of Poetics and Semiotics, a school of thinkers that would include Israel's leading scholars of the period. Among them, Menachem Perry and Mary Sternberg. This is Perry and Sternberg that we will return to later on, but also many other important and central names like Itamar Even-Zohar, Yael Renan, and others. The Tel Aviv School drew deeply on American new criticism and its close reading method at the level of textual interpretation and the micro-level engagement with the literary work. The Tel Aviv School translated the term close reading into two terms in Hebrew. One is Kriyat Tzmuda, which can be translated as attached reading, and the other is Kriya Maximalit, maximalist reading. Now, maximum connotes, of course, both quantitative and qualitative abundance. And indeed, the school conceptualized close reading at its best as the assembling of the greatest number of textual elements under one interpretation. The term tzmuda resonates in Hebrew with two central meanings. The adjective tzamud resembles the English close, but denotes a tighter physical proximity, significantly closer than the Hebrew term for close, which is karov. Tzamud hints at being attached, having an intimacy with the text almost overbearing. And indeed, the Tel Aviv School scholars demanded of their readers a forensic examination of the text, a scrutiny of details considerably more intense than the one exhibited in the American case. The second meaning of tzamud, as a participle derived from the three-letter verb tzamad, evokes the verb latzmid, which signifies coupling, pairing, bringing elements together, an act of consolidation and unification. And this is where integration comes into play. The school members imagined the process of reading first and foremost as an act of centralization, of exhausting or maximizing the possible connections between all apparently peripheral details in the text. In this spirit, you can see Harshav and Ben Porat write in one of their first manifestations of the theory, and I'm reading from the second quote. A text is a body of language full of gaps, ellipses, and unlinked units to be read and understood, that is, to be filled out and reorganized in the mind of the proper reader. For members of the school, the ideal reader was one that exhausted all the possible connections between the different details of the text, so that every detail, however marginal it may be, revealed itself under the interpretation of the reader as functional within the work's fabric. This method was developed within Harshav's flagship theory, which was tellingly titled Integrational Semantics. Menachem Perry, whom I've mentioned before, became Harshav's most famous scholar and then colleague within the Israeli sphere. And this is the way he defines maximalist reading. Again, the same as attached reading. And he writes, the drama of reading will push to the focus of attention unconsidered and unnoticed details from the rubbish heap, as it were, of our observations, to borrow Freud's wording in Moses and Michelangelo. And these accumulated details will suddenly click into convergence that will offer us a new key to the main aspects of the story. And the other way around. Only in light of a decision to raise the threshold of exhaustion will my reading proposal be considered effective and preferable. Anyone not seeking a maximal reading will have no need for my reading hypothesis. As evident from these quotations, the scholars of the school sought to produce, through their reading practice, a reader skilled in creating unity, to create a proper mind. But they also guided these readers toward works of literature that they perceived as encouraging this cognitive effort of intention and integration. And you will not be surprised to learn that the body of work that was considered by the Tel Aviv school as best for integrational attention was the work of William Faulkner, which again brings us back to the American New Critics. And these school members were also a very important part of processes of translation of Faulkner into Hebrew. So why did they like Faulkner's work so much? Sternberg and Perry refer to Faulkner in their well-known articles, The King Through Ironic Eyes and the Dynamic of the Literary Text. There, they describe his works as appearing superficially fragmented, their parts seemingly disconnected. But, according to Perry and Sternberg, Faulkner's works actually and covertly guide the reader in how to reassemble the fragments of the work. That is, Faulkner's work encourages the close maximalist reader to perform the effort of integration and rewards her for this effort through the eventual possibility of revealing a work impressive in its complex unity. And the Tel Aviv school refer to this attribute of Faulkner's work as what they refer to as difficult integration. In the Israeli context, Yehoshua was Faulkner's most distinctive follower and admirer. There are, of course, other Israeli authors who explicitly followed Faulkner, like Amos Oz, Benjamin Tammuz, and David Grossman, but no doubt Yehoshua was the one most pronouncedly engaged with Faulkner's work, especially in the novels that he wrote during the 70s and early 80s, The Lover from 77 and Les Divorces from 82. In fact, he explicitly declared that these are Faulknerian novels, and Les Divorces opens with a quote from The Sound and the Fury. But before I approach this Faulkner, Yehoshua, and Tel Aviv school triangle, I want to say something about the meaning of the concept of integration as it accumulated during the long 1970s in Israel. The Israeli 1970s are famous for their radical political and social instability, witnessing dramatic military events and significant revolts against established power structures, predominantly controlled by Jewish Israelis, particularly those with Ashkenazi, that is Central or Eastern European descent. And I have to say, in a side note, the things that started in the 1970s are very much apparent today. A pivotal moment was the 6 Days War in 1967, which not only dissolved clear national borders with the conquest of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, but also precipitated a series of profound social rifts. Shortly thereafter, the Mizrahi uprising emerged, involving Jews of North African and Middle Eastern descent who have historically confronted social and economic disparities in comparison with their Ashkenazi counterparts. This era also witnessed the significant rise of the public voice of Israeli Arabs, the devastating toll and impact of the Yom Kippur War in 73, and the consequent game-changing elections of 77, where the Labour Party lost to the right-wing Likud Party for the first time since the establishment of the state. Under these conditions, the fractured nature of the then young and immigrant-based nation was exposed. The widespread ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious tensions, along with their accompanying prejudices and discriminations, rose to the surface. These changes were experienced as a threatening process of disintegration, especially by the white liberal left that was losing its political standing, a group that included the majority of Israeli intellectuals, and specifically the scholars and writers that this talk follows. This is, for example, how the literary critic Ariel Hirschfeld, among many others, describes the 1970s. The political turnover, the Likud's ascendancy to power, shook up Israeli society's profile. That moment made it possible to view Israeli society as an assemblage and not one thing, an assortment of ethnic groups, edot, and communities, settlements and regions, a rabble of human beings who could be very different from each other. In this apocalyptic atmosphere of fragmentation and disintegration, the Israeli government of '68 also implemented a new policy in education system that was unsurprisingly called social integration, integracja chinuchit. And this program, whose title has since been conventionalized into an Israeli idiom, included placing students from privileged and unprivileged ethnic and socioeconomic groups together in Israeli middle schools in order to increase educational equality. And you can see here the significant rise of the term integration, actually the Hebraized term integracja, in the Hebrew press of the time. This is all to show you that during this time, the anxiety over and the use of the concept of integration and disintegration was truly omnipresent. Is it coincidental then that during this very period, representing a sense of disintegration, a group of literary critics emerges focusing on mending and unifying different elements in the literary text and attempting to produce readers who are experts in integration? I want to argue, of course, that no, this is not accidental. And even though the Tel Aviv school's scholars ardently presented themselves as apolitical, their method of reading and maximalist close reading was heavily charged with a political valence. Yehoshua's work, as I mentioned, sits at the intersection between Faulkner's American literature, American new criticism writing about him, the reception of new criticism by the Tel Aviv school, and the Israeli political tensions of the time. And I want to take his novel, Late Divorce, from '82, as an example. The novel follows the story of Yehuda Kaminka as he returns to Israel from the US to seek a divorce from his wife. His wife, Nomi, is hospitalized in a mental ward. And Yehuda is ultimately murdered by his wife's friend in the ward. This narrative slowly unfolds through a series of internal monologues of different family members. Anyone who remembers The Sound and the Fury, it is precisely the same format, adopting Faulkner's stream of consciousness technique and his method of multiple voices. Since the Kaminka family members seem to represent different parts of Israeli society, religious and secular, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, and since the family structure itself breaks down during the novel has consistently been read as a national allegory pointing to the state of disintegration in Israeli society. And I can give you one example out of many of reviews that take that position with regards to the novel. For example, Shmuel Huppert in '83 writes in a telling title, "The Center Cannot Hold," or "The Center That Lost Its Unifying Force." He writes, "Disintegration reaches beyond the personal to the collective. Nomi, who, losing her sanity, tries to murder her husband, embodies the violence of her family and of Israeli society, whose tribal, traditional, fatherly center no longer holds it together." What these critics, however, do not take into account is the affinity between Yehoshua's obsession with social disintegration and the Tel Aviv school ideal of maximalist reading. They also rarely discuss the connection Yehoshua might have found between Faulkner's own investment in American social dismantling and his own. Indeed, Yehoshua is attracted to Faulkner's novels precisely because they deal with disintegration both formally and thematically. And Yehoshua makes this clear only once when explaining, and tellingly he does it to his American interviewer, Joseph Cohen, that his interest in Faulkner's narratological method of multiple voice was fueled by political preoccupations. And this is what Yehoshua tells his American interviewer. Faulkner's monologue provided a form to mirror the gradual crumbling of the center of national values and cultural experience, a process that only intensified in the 80s. Because the ideological center of Israel was dismantling itself, we, the writers of the 1970s, felt we didn't have the possibility of really representing the Israeli society through an authoritative, controlling single voice. It's no longer possible to close off a universe the way Faulkner did. I am a writer of the subject. I would be happy if I had a world, but I don't. Again, I return to Faulkner. The actions in his novels can occur within a 3-mile radius. There are all those family connections and other kinds of connections, such as those between Absalom and the Sound and the Fury. Yehoshua echoes here Perry and Sternberg's position, identifying Faulkner's work as having a structure of effortful integration, of difficult integration. He sees The Sound and the Fury and Absalom as novels that present readers with a fragmented reality, refracted through multiple voices, but one that nonetheless manages to close off a universe, to produce a unified reality with internal connectivity. Yehoshua is well aware that for Faulkner, this structure has political implications. After all, Faulkner himself was deeply invested in trying to create a form that would reflect, perhaps even heal, the profound rift opened in American society after the Civil War. Cohen, Yehoshua's interviewer, notes this parallel and writes, Yehoshua observes the shredding fabric of Israel in the same way that Faulkner described the disintegration of the post-Civil War American South. The fact that Yehoshua views Faulkner's internal monologues and their representation of social fracture through the Tel Aviv school's concepts of integration comes to the fore most readily in the novel's final chapter. This chapter is titled The Final Night, and it was written with the rest of the novel in the 1970s, but was only published in the 2010 edition of the book. And here you can see Menachem Perry and Aleph Bet Yehoshua many years later. And this is where I should note that Menachem Perry was not only a central scholar in the Tel Aviv school, he was, and still is today, a central literary editor. And he has edited Yehoshua's work throughout his career. So this final chapter focuses on the consciousness of the family dog Horus, who is revealed through his name and through the chapter as paradoxically being the family's great poet. According to Perry and Yehoshua, they initially decided together that the chapter didn't align with the rest of the novel, and so decided in the 1980s not to publish it. But the terminology that both Perry and Yehoshua used to describe their later decision to publish the chapter years later points to a maximalist way of thinking. Perry defines their initial decision as mistaken because he realizes that the chapter transforms, this is the old and new version. He describes the decision as mistaken because he realized that the chapter transforms the entire novel, giving it a new code, acting as a kind of magnet that reorganizes the whole book, drawing to itself details from throughout the novel. What's interesting is that Horus actually mocks this interpretative approach throughout the last chapter. And Perry himself notes, in a sideline, The Final Night is a parody of several writers and scholars, including myself. Indeed, throughout the chapter, Horus conducts a conversation with what seems like a reader or writer, both holding to a Tel Aviv school standard of clique-inducing literature. What would you like me to be, the chapter reads, a dog or a symbol of a dog? First person, second person, maybe third? I would leave that with you, but who would provide you with a code? The reference to this code as the Tel Aviv school's idea of solving the text as a unity becomes even more explicit when Horus mockingly continues. Should I turn the reader into a dog? With great pleasure. Gap filling? Be my guest. The reader as the constructor of meaning? I've heard that as well. But the desire for order, the integration, is found to be impossible in this final chapter. Horus insists, Imitation of what? Of stream of consciousness? Don't make me laugh. Installing a microphone in the brain or soul? You will find nothing but a whirlpool, not gaps, but abysses. Splashes of thoughts smeared all over quivering objects. Voices opened up into sounds. Shards of information hiding in memories. Emotions snuggling, unordered, unorganized. So in conclusion, I want to suggest that Yehoshua's work points to a possible motivation for the Tel Aviv school's emphasis on the cognitive readerly process of integration. It was an attempt to produce an Israeli subject who could mentally try to mend the fabric of Israeli society that seemed to be unraveling. A reader or subject who could create connections where they seemed to be gone or perhaps were. Yehoshua hints at his own attempt through his writing to produce a reader who would know how to reconnect both the novella and the Kaminka family and Israeli society writ large. But Yehoshua himself was skeptical, as the final chapter reveals. After all, the characters' stream of consciousness, like the society they represent, contains not bridgeable gaps, but abysses, thought fragments without organization, without order. So unfortunately, I'm left with no time to raise points for consideration about how we read today. But my view, I hope you could see, was that in order to look forward, we have to look back as well. We often labor under the illusion that while we must read literary text historically, taking into account the context in which works were written, published, translated, circulated, we seem to somehow approach theories synchronically, as if they were a toolkit from which we can pull close reading one day and deconstruction the next. But the truth is that theories are no less historical, local, and varied than literary works. In addition, methods hold implicit assumptions about the subjectivity of their readers, and they shape us, our ways of thinking, reading, and being. So if we want to consider what close reading was, is, or may be, we have to first ask ourselves how and where close reading was developed and how it worked to make us its practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an amazing lecture, which clarified a lot of things for me.
Oh, wonderful.
Primarily because it brought to the fore, like, when you listed off the authors in this Tel Aviv school, that I had read selections of at various points in my academic career, but hadn't really made the connection or to close reading per se. Because I'm trained in antiquity, I'd studied Tanakh and history of interpretation, and a lot of those authors are sort of in the oeuvre of what we make graduate students read to learn about the quote-unquote literary method of biblical studies.
Right. We just talked about it today.
As opposed to like contradistinction from historicists' philological readings.
Right.
Although I think they're related. But it strikes me that, and perhaps you could comment on this and this shift into the long 70s in Israeli society, how that project of creating a new critical mode of reading, which, I mean, Sternberg has his massive book on literary models of reading biblical text. Menachem Perry's work as well, and Ziva Ben Porat is used in biblical studies, but not for those reasons. In what sense is that trying to reconstruct the Tanakh or approaches to the Tanakh to sort of counter earlier modes of reading that Ben Gurion had put forward in the 50s and 60s broadly in society, and thinking about how the Bible is used in Israeli society as a mode of constructing meaning as well? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that idea.
Yeah, there are many answers to this really interesting questions. I'll take one, but if you want me to then elaborate, I can. And I actually have been a TA for Perry for many years at the time. So I was really teaching, I think I can quote some of these articles. For them, what was unique about the Bible and what they were most interested in, which is why they read specific portions of the Bible in their works, is that it created the same sensation of difficult integration that they found in Faulkner as well, right? So the fact that the biblical text was so dense and gave up so little and has left so much work of integration at the hands of the reader, for them was a fertile ground, precisely in order to substantiate their claims through works that were highly canonical, right? So the Bible on the one hand and Faulkner on the other, right? So I think Perry to date even would say that the work that he is most proud of is the King Trironic Eyes, which did precisely that, right? Taking this very canonical chapter of David and Bathsheba and showing how if you raise the threshold of exhaustion to its limit, then you can see that the editor of this biblical text was really pushing you to come up with two countering arguments that would then lead to one central conclusion that would be true to both of these arguments. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it is the form of the biblical text that was really attractive for them, with their emphasis on integration. I hope this makes sense.
No, it does. It strikes me as well, too, also that the text which they're interested in reading, like, Ben Gurion was very interested in Shoftim.
Exactly.
Right? And Yehoshua is his primary text, right? But they seem to be more interested in Shmuel and Lachim,
Yes.
saying on Kings is the primary loci of reading.
And Genesis, I would say, as well.
Genesis as well, right? So, like, those become, like, they're creating a new kind of canon.
Exactly.
Really use of the Bible.
Exactly.
This is very helpful.
Yes, and I would say one last thing about it, that there is another kind of a debate there underneath the surface against the Hebrew University. So the tradition there would have been to read every literary text as a national allegory. Right. And they're trying to say, no, we can take the text of Jewish tradition and read it universally, not through the lens of the specific national context.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anna.
I'm like trying to organize this thought I had into a question. It's probably going to be more like a, can you say more about ABC?
Go for it.
Okay. One of the things that was just like a delight in listening was your ear for a quote. There were like at least two places where I was like, oh my God. The first was just that moment from Freud where he says details from the rubbish heap.
Yes.
As it were.
Yes.
Where he's not going to close read himself, but he seems like aware that there's something there in excess of the little idiom.
Yeah.
That just a little example. Like we can't talk about what we don't need to. The one that maybe because it was so close to the ending, the one that is like really like messing me up is that line about installing a microphone in the brain or the soul.
Yes.
Like it would just be chaos, an abyss.
Yes.
And one of the things that struck me about it was it sounds like from the passage you shared. It sounds somewhere in the realm of free and direct discourse, or I think you used the phrase interior monologue. And I'm interested in what your take is alongside the history of close reading, the history of these like strategies to like try to get as close as possible to that mess. And like I'm thinking about like earlier instantiations of the novel that begin as like epistolary fiction where someone is writing pretty explicitly, directly, and neatly to someone else. And then like the modernism stuff happens and people are like, actually, it's really messy. So then like the prose starts to try to mimic the messiness. But now we have a moment where the messiness itself is saying, no, it's even messier than we could even begin to like put into language.
Right.
And like, what is the future? What is the like I can't imagine we have novels like any harder to read than like I don't know Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, but like a line like that, if we installed a microphone in the brain of the soul, it would actually yield static or like I'm putting words in your mouth.
Yes.
I would love to hear you talk more about say what the future of close reading is, given that the trajectory, given that the trajectory of these representative techniques that literature gives us would seem to be, given that quote, would seem to be leading more and more towards like incoherence.
Yeah.
Okay, long.
No, I love all of these. I hope I can say anything, so I'll try by snippets. Because I think both with the Freud and with the Yehoshua, we're in the realm of the mind, right? Or the mind's mess. So I'll start by saying something about the way that the Tel Aviv school reads Freud, right? Which I think answers, because they would take Freud's oeuvre or the Bible, but they would read it very differently than the way we might do it today, right? So for Perry, Freud was the ultimate close reader. So he turns to Freud. Actually, I remember in his classes he would say, you know, I came up with these ideas before I read Freud, but for him, Freud, when he turns to Freud, it's not Freud of the unconscious or Freud of the navel that would say like every dream has a point in which it is inconceivable. For Perry, Freud is the one who is able to take every small detail in the dream and cohere it, right? So that he turns to Freud from, I think, very different approach from what you are. He admires Freud for order and cohesion of the mess, of the mental mess. But again, as with Freud and the Bible, the Tel Aviv school turns to literary works or to theories that deal with the mess, right? So they want to come close to Faulkner because of his messiness, or to the dream world because of its messiness, because they say, even the biggest mess, we can put our hands into it, and you will see that we can show you order, right? So I think it's precisely the anxiety that you're talking about that they're both attracted to and are dealing with. Like, we want to go as close as you can to the problem of the mind, but we will show you that with the proper mind, one can solve this rubbish heap. It won't seem like that anymore. Yeah.
I want to see if I'm picking up what you're putting down. Like,
yes.
It seems like the survey you're giving us is like a way of reading the intuits that like the bigger the mess, the more detail.
Exactly.
And in turn, and this is a phrase from earlier, you were describing close reading as a tool for self-formation.
Exactly.
Like the mind that is able to do the piecing together is vindicated the bigger the...
Exactly. Exactly. Precisely. That's why they turn to the most difficult, both ancient and but I want to say something about the microphone, because I do think there is an element of sound in new criticism, especially I have to say in the American case. So we were talking about it just earlier today, that the figure of the urn becomes so central to Cleanth Brooks, and generally so, and that if you read them closely, perhaps too maximally, you see that they're really interested in the way that voice echoes as a way that texts echo within us. And if you look at Faulkner, I think he does something very similar. So he talks, for example, about Quentin in The Sound of Fury and Absalom as the best reader. Why? Because he's able to empty himself and become an echo chamber to voices of others. So I think there is something there about close reading as an ability to put a microphone and listen to internal voices, but it's a different tradition from the Israeli one. I hope it, just like opening, yeah.
So I have a kind of an unformed, I was sort of thinking about personal thinking, but the wonderful
Here you go.
really just so thought-provoking, but just, thank you. But thinking about, the way that you sort of situate all of this coming to a head in the 70s, I think very convincingly, given the political upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
Then we think about the 80s as the sort of the decade when postmodernism would come to a head in Israel, right?
Yes.
Hebrew postmodernism, and you have people like Oli Kastelblum,
Absolutely.
Yoel Hoffman, right? And these are, and it strikes me, as you're talking about Peri and about Yehoshua and about this almost like a collaboration,
right?
Maybe not almost, really a collaboration, Yehoshua actually saying, I am the Hebrew Faulkner, more or less, right? Sort of announcing himself very explicitly that this is his project. And I wonder if, in so many ways, I think we think already of the literature of the 1980s as a kind of a backlash to a lot that was happening before, but never had I considered the role of this kind of tension between the critic and author on the one hand, in sort of almost in cahoots, and the tension between sort of their expectations, their hopes, and maybe something even more stronger than that in terms of the reader, right? And then comes Yoel Hoffman and starts playing with gender in the language in inexplicable ways and dotting his works with untranslated bits of various other languages, which no reader probably knows all of those languages, right? And it's okay, and there's no explanation, and there's no expectation, and there's no, I mean, do you see those things as related?
Yes, I think this is absolutely related. I'll give you one example of what you mentioned, right? Orly Kasselblum, for example. She tries to start within the institution, right? Like Aleph Bet Yehoshua. And she goes to Tel Aviv and she starts writing there. And she's pushed out, right? Like literally, no one understands what she's writing about. It's not in these terms of like a well-wrought, intricate text that really invites one to look at the details. It's crazy. It is unordered in no way that can be put back together. And then these writers like Orly Kasselblum, Yoel Hoffman, Edgar Keret, all of whom wrote outside the institution, are really a backlash against these, symbiotic relationship between this generation and the literary institution and what follows. And it's also the time where close reading in Israel really wanes, and we see the rise of Hanan Hever, post-colonialism, very different kind of theories that enter the Israeli mainstream of thought. But there would never be, again, the kind of symbiosis between literary writers and scholars, at least till today, as we see in this period.
Right. But interestingly, in the case of Orly Kasselblum, is that what seems to have saved her, in quotation marks in some respect, is that she got the seal of approval from
the public.
Samech Izhar. Also,
that's true.
Who still, I mean, he's canonical, but in a very different way than Yehoshua is canonical,
Absolutely.
right? And known for different things, and so it's a really interesting kind of tension again.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
I would say, though, that these writers mostly started or were pushed forward by the public rather than the institution. Yeah.
I mean, Edgar Keret, I'm sorry, but it just occurred to me that I heard him say once that a point of pride for him was that his publisher, somebody told him his books are stolen more than any other books in Israeli bookstores, and this is to him, this is not a relationship with Menachem Pele, but a different kind of relationship with the reader.
They were not embraced by the institution in the beginning at all. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you, really. It was a pleasure.